So I'm on the road a lot these days because I've made a film. I made a film about the war on drugs called The House I Live In. And it's a movie really about what the drug war has done to poor Americans, particularly Americans of color, over 40 years. And I've been on the road a lot with the film because the subject means a huge amount to me, and it's kind of a human rights crisis that I want to bring to light for as many Americans as I can. So it's very exciting for me to be here today, in fact, to step back from that usual programming that I'm in, that usual conversation, which is a quite despairing one, to be able to step back and take stock of where I am personally as a storyteller trying to seek social change, and where we all are as people who believe in story and believe in media as a force for good and want to see a better world. You know, the 10-year anniversary of the Iraq War just passed, and it was a very intense decade for so many people around the world, and it was a very intense decade in seeing sort of the darkest of our foreign policy, our public policy. But it was also an era to look on the bright side of things that saw a very seismic shift that we've all felt in how storytelling and how individual voices can contribute to the global narrative about even the most challenging world events like the war we saw unfold. It all started for me about a decade ago when I was making a movie called Why We Fight. And it was a movie that I actually had the naive idea at the time might even stop the war or slow it down or make even the slightest dent in it, which it didn't. It made some dent in a conversation, and that meant a lot to me. But while I was making it, I had a very formative experience in terms of managing my expectations, I guess you'd say. I was sitting in a restaurant in the Lower West Side of Manhattan. It's a place called Shopson's. I don't know if people know it, but it's a tiny little hole in the wall run by Ken Shopson. And he serves soups and all kinds of foods from thousands of places around the world. And he serves you that, and he also serves up a lot of sort of unsolicited advice. So he sat down with me and he said, hey, I was having a Senegalese chicken cherry concoction of some kind. And he said, I heard about that movie you're making, Why We Fight. And I said, yeah, what do you think? I care a lot about his opinion. And he said, well, I think it sounds okay. He says, I think there's a right way and a wrong way to make that thing. And I said, how's that? And he said, well, look, he said, you seem to think you're part of some movement. And I'm not going to argue with you about whether you are or you're not. Time Out magazine that week had referred to him as an aging radical, and he said it was a double insult. So he said, so I'm not going to argue with you about whether you're right or you're not, but I will say that if there's a movement, everybody has a role to play. He said, me, I probably make the cupcakes. Somebody else, they're writing up pamphlets. Somebody else is directing traffic. You, he said, you're the guy with the flashlight. Your job with that flashlight is to shine it into dark spaces and show people things in that darkness that they might not have known were there. He said, but the problem with you, Eugene, is you're a very ambitious person and you're a very emotional person. So right away, you're going to find things in the darkness there that are going to make you upset because of your emotions. They're going to make you mad. But because you're an ambitious person, you might then get the idea that you could take your flashlight and use it as a stick, not as a flashlight. And you could try to sort of strike out at whatever it is or whoever it is that's causing that pain. And in that case, with the Iraq War, it was the usual suspects. It was Dick Cheney and Halliburton and all the other monsters who unfolded themselves. He said, but you have to understand, these people, these forces, they are built and they always have been built far beyond your reach. And so all you'll do if you try to strike out at them with your stick flashlight is that you'll jump around like a 9-year-old, flailing it around all over the place. Your beam of light will never land long enough for anyone to get anything from it. And so they will get nothing and you will fail. And then he went back to make a BLT for somebody and another bowl of soup and left me with his meal of ideas to consume. But I did try to live up to it at that time. It did change my mode of thinking about myself and what I do. And it was a high time for that to happen because the world itself was leaning that way. We were watching the democratization of filmmaking happen about a decade ago, when the sum total of all those technological advances sort of came to fruition, and we had cheaper, more accessible, more usable cameras by everyday people than ever before. And we saw this have an amazing impact on the global narrative. It started with the CNN effect, which during the Gulf War, as you may remember, was what it was like when you had one major power controlling all the images of a war it was running. But then that got complicated by the technology and by the spread of it all into the Jazeera Effect that we saw in the Iraq War. Because in the Iraq War, it wasn't just one side controlling the images. Now you had a duality of ideas, but still sort of central powers, central protagonists in the action, standing off against one another. So it wasn't democratic enough. We watched it evolve further in the streets of Madrid, in the streets of London, when the bombings there were covered by every manner of person young and old, with their cell phone. You could call it almost a Nokia effect, because I think they were the company at the time. I'm not sure if they're still in business. Maybe they are. But they were covering that from every angle, all those little images, and they were participating suddenly in the global narrative. But it was all coming to us from, again, the usual suspects, CBS, NBC, BBC, the usual suspects giving us their portion of the global narrative. But then it evolved one step further, and I think came to its zenith in the execution of Saddam Hussein, which you all may remember was captured by somebody on his cell phone and then quickly uploaded to the world so the world could see how that execution had been carried out. And the interesting thing about that is I don't think there's ever been a more powerful moment where images stood in the way of the usual conduct of power in the world. Because were it not for that person who captured those images, the President of the United States that morning would have come to the Oval Office and reported to the American people that in the newly founded Democratic Republic of Iraq, there had been a peaceful, orderly transition of power in which a leader had passed and would be replaced by a newly democratic leader. And instead, what the world had already seen before even one word could be uttered from the Oval Office was essentially what looked like an act of thuggery in a basement somewhere in the shadows without any of the sort of peaceful, orderly pomp that goes along with the evolution of a state. And so now the global narrative could no longer be what they wanted it to be. They, being central powers who had launched a war, could no longer say, we dropped bombs and made democracy with bombs, something that history has never shown us is possible. Democracy is a sort of indigenous condition that arises and had never been dropped from an aircraft before. And so the notion that that was going to be sellable on the world was interrupted by the inconvenient reality that came out of that cell phone and that upload. And so it was an amazing and heady time to see truth being spoken to power, more powerfully, I think, than ever before. The leader of the world, unable to carry out the usual narrative, thanks to the actions of a single individual somewhere in the world. So I felt great to be a part of all this. And that shining of a light, as that cell phone did and as I hope to do with my work, was meaning so much. But very quickly I started to get the feeling that it wasn't enough, that it was inadequate, and that shining my light was not going to make the kind of change that I sought to see in the world, that we were shining lights with our films and with our media in so many directions, and we weren't seeing rapid enough or meaningful enough change. So at that point I decided there was a role for the stick, and I had to figure out how to do that. And as I started to sort of poke around and think about that, another mentor, Ralph Nader, criticized my film, Why We Fight. And he said to me, you know, it's a good film you made, but I don't see that you deploy it very well. And that word deploy really stung. It's been living with me ever since. How do you deploy a film? What are the ways to get out there and use your film? Well, I was very fortunate because Ralph's words might have stung, but they foresaw exactly what would then happen in our sort of digital global commons, where all of a sudden not only had filmmaking been democratized, as happened during that technological revolution, but now the distribution of films was being democratized. Getting them out to the public was becoming far more possible and far more facile than ever before. I live in a small New England town, and I own the local movie theater, and I've watched movie-going sort of shrink over the years for anything serious. People just come out to see 3D spectacles, basically. But what they are doing is watching serious movies more and more in digital ways, lots of ways, on their home computer screen or on a handheld device or any number of other ways that they share them. And so all of a sudden, I learned very quickly to try to embrace this new world order in which not only could films be sort of distributed to people and shown to people in new and different ways that weren't conventional theatrical moviegoing, but that could be combined with all of the activity that arises out of the global commons, that arises out of the interconnectedness of social media. And so I embraced that. I started to, as kind of a layman to it. I'm a movie maker. Compared to the high-tech thinkers today, I am very primitive. And so I started to figure out on the fly, how do I look like the other guys? So I started to think, okay, I have this new movie, The House I Live In, which I care a great deal to get out. And I really want people to understand how wrong the drug war is. And I really want them to understand it, not just in liberal movie theaters and art houses around the country. I really want them to understand it out in the hustings, where it counts the most. And so what do? I want to bring the mountain to Muhammad. I really want to get the movie to prisons, churches, schools, community centers, which we do. And we do it thanks to these technologies. I walk into a prison, as I did about 10 days ago, with a projector under one arm, a digital video player, which is essentially a computer under the other, and then kind of dangling from my pinky is a duffel bag in which I've got a 40-foot foldable movie screen. And within a matter of 15 minutes, 20 minutes, we've got the gymnasium in a prison converted into the closest thing those guys will ever likely see again to a movie theater. and you show a movie about prison life and about the unfairness of the system to prisoners, and you begin to move a mountain, I think. It's a conversation among the prisoners and outward toward their families. About 30 million people in this country who have a loved one in the system. And so that's a conversation I want to be able to make happen, and it meant forgetting my love of the movie screen, forgetting my love of the movie theater going experience, and embracing a new kind of commons. But that, of course, combines with life in the digital space, where extraordinary things happen if you unlearn your old love of the silver screen. Because when somebody's watching my movie on a computer screen or on a handheld screen, they have an ability that they don't have in a movie theater. I used to think that we go to the movies and we sit cheek by jowl and we, take in some great reckoning in a little room, and then we go out into the night, we grab a pitchfork and we march on the Capitol. You remember doing that, right? Well, we think of doing that, but we really just go out for Ben & Jerry's. And then we talk about the movie. And all those political animations we felt about changing the world, they very often filter out into the night air. Yet, when somebody watches my movie in a digital fashion, they can click the whole time if they'd like to. Nobody's going to tell them to put their cell phone away. They're sitting at home. They can Google, they can tweet, they can Facebook, whatever's coming down the pike. And all that interconnectivity builds community, constituency for changing a situation like America's war on drugs, for raising awareness about any of the subjects that plague our consciences, anything that we most care about. There is now an interconnectivity, and I'm in a way stating the obvious, but it isn't obvious very often when you're making the piece and when you're trying to figure out that balancing act between the flashlight and the stick. And so what I've learned almost came to a head, I think, in that there is a combined moment now of past and present, of the traditional and the non-traditional, that we need to embrace as creative people. It happened for me on inaugural weekend, and I'll sort of close with this anecdote. The president was going to be elected. There is nothing I want more in the world than to cast a shadow over that inauguration that is the black cloud of the American drug war and its crisis of human indecency. And so I want to do that, but how do you do that? I tried to contact all the old traditional media outlets with my press people and say, hey, you got to have Eugene on to really rain on the parade. They don't want to do that. But I had to get out there somewhere. So we got on the ground, and we got on the ground both in the digital sense and in the grassroots, true on-the-ground sense. And we went to Shiloh Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., the largest Baptist church in the capital. And on the very weekend that the inauguration was unfolding, we held a large screening of my film inside the church. I almost said inside the theater, but I might as well have. Because we filmed the event. It was myself, John Legend, Danny Glover, Congressman Bobby Scott, Charles Ogletree, the mentor of the president, and we all made a presentation to the audience with the film about the wrongness of the war on drugs, to an audience so many of whose family members are touched so deeply by it. And so as that was unfolding, that wasn't enough. We also filmed it digitally with new 3G technologies that send a high-def signal out to a URL. And in advance, we had stoked up the social media landscape, so that very raw, on-the-ground event had become a huge talking point among church groups all over the country. So we gave those church groups, about 250 of them, our URL. And they could now tune in live and watch this episode unfold at Shiloh Baptist Church. And so this small event became so much more than the sum of its parts. 200 and something churches is about 70,000 people watching something where about 1,500 were present. And it was all about embracing the new, the technologically new and the technically new. We were there using those technologies to show in what was called the sanctuary inside the church. We'd penetrated the sanctuary with new technology. But we also had not forgotten the past, the need to publicize it. So I got on the phone and told CNN, hey, there's a big noise happening at Shiloh Baptist Church. There's all kinds of crowds out front, and they're filming it, and they're sending it out to churches. And so they covered it. And lo and behold, we had our cake and we ate it too. And on the morning of the inauguration, as the president was being sworn in, I was honored enough to sit with John Legend on CNN and make the drug war an issue that would not go away, as it should not go away. Thank you very, very much.